Good morning. Yes, for the state treasurer, Mr. Juarez. For the state controller, Ms. Paquin. Mr. Rosensteel.
Here.
Ms. Iga. Ms. Yamamoto.
Here.
Ms. Hendricks.
Here.
Mr. Keeley.
Here.
Ms. Vargas. For the state superintendent of public instruction, Ms. Sumant. And for the director of finance, Ms. Wong Hernandez. Chairperson Dillon, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. We are running a little bit late already this morning, so I would ask for a motion to approve the board agenda with flexibility, please. It's been moved and seconded. Any questions? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? We've approved our agenda with flexibility, and as we get closer to lunch, we might have to play with some items. Jack, I'm turning it over to you
Thanks.
for the board election.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the annual election that you conduct before the start of the fiscal year for the chair and the vice chair positions. We do two separate votes for those positions. So I'll open this up for motions for chair. We have a motion from Mr. Keeley, please.
Thanks, Dana. I'd like to nominate our longest-serving teacher, an outstanding chair, to serve another year as the chair of our board, Dana Dillon.
Thank you. That motion is order. A motion by Mr. Keeley to nominate Dana Dillon. Do I have a second? Second by Karen Yamamoto. Any other motions for nomination? Seeing none, the motion is order. All in favor, please say aye. Oppose? Congratulations.
Thank you, guys.
Wonderful. I think we've still got a few tough issues for you to handle in the coming year. It's not going to be an easy slide.
No. We'll play.
Now we'll take nominations for vice chair of the board. Mr. Keeley.
Thank you, Jack.
I gotcha.
It's my honor to nominate my friend, outstanding board member, and great leader in Los Angeles, Sharon Hendricks, to vice chair the board this year as well.
Thank you, Mr. Keeley. Do we have a second to the motion? A second by Ms. Vargas. Any other nominations for vice chair? Seeing none, the motion's order. All in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Oppose? And congratulations, Ms. Hendricks. Yay.
All right, slave drivers that we are, we're going to get right to business. Yes. Harry. Oh, God, Harry.
I just think it's appropriate. I think it should be noted that the Teachers Retirement Fund, 70% of our members are women. And this Teachers Pension Fund is led by two teacher female educators. And I think that's a testament to who we are, and they're doing a great job.
Thank you. That's culture and our privilege. All righty, our actuarial evaluations and the benefits and rates. We're going to turn it over to you, Jack, to kick it off.
Great. All right. Well, this is really the heart of the day for us, is the actuarial piece. We had budgeted time-wise that this would take us through up to the lunch, so we've got a couple good hours ahead of us here. I did want to note one change in case you are using a downloaded version of the board book from before. We caught one date that was wrong on the resolutions on items 3B and C. It's a minor issue, but it's been corrected on the web version, and the date for the effect of the resolution should be today's board date and not a year ago. So minor issue. As you can see, in my 16 years here doing these valuations with you, someone is missing, and that is Rick Reed, who's always here with you as our chief actuary. And Rick had a personal commitment in Texas, so he asked if he could make that work, and we had so much preparation. As you know, you got these materials quite in advance, and the team here has been working out and everything, so we thought that would work fine. I gave you a handout from the board policy manual just in case there are some questions later on around one of the items. I wanted to make sure you had the policy in front of you and how the rate is actually in your policy calculated. So we'll get to that in a little bit. I think this is one of the biggest changes at CalSTRS over the year is just the deepening of the actuarial bench. Not only do you have Nick and Mark up here for a number of years, they've been our very constructive business partners, our external actuaries, but now Jordan and David are up here as well. And it's our goal to have more actuaries than attorneys, and we're almost there. So you've got a really strong set of people here to help you today. So David, are you going to start it off?
Yeah, I'll start off. Good morning, everyone. That's correct. You can never have enough actuaries and attorneys. Yes, correct. Just before I start, yeah, I just want to say a few things. I just want to make sure we all remember where we came from. Just 4 years ago, almost to date, the system was headed toward insolvency. We were telling everyone we were going to run out of money. And then after a decade-long effort to try to solve this issue, AB 1469 was passed, and we got what we call the CalSTRS funding plan. Finally, as board members, you have the ability, it's limited, but you have ability to adjust contribution rates to ensure that we fully fund our benefit. And what I want you to remember, you're going to see this today as we present to you the results. The main message I want all of you to remember today is the funding plan is working. We are going to reach 100% full funding, but the path to get there is going to be slow at first. Even if the projections you're going to see today, even just 10 years from now, we're still going to be around 70% funded. And 20 years from now, probably around 80% funded, okay? And what I want all of you to remember is this was known and it was expected when the funding plan was designed, because to help everyone prepare for these increases in contribution rate, they were phased in over time so that everyone had time to prepare for them. So what we want to make sure is as we go along, and you're going to see today, we expect to see more increases in contributions over the next few years. It's important that we stay the course. These contributions, these increases are needed so that we can reach 100% full funding. And having a target of 100% full funding is key for our system long-term to be able to be sustainable. And it also, just would like to point out also, it's also recommended actual practice in the United States that pension fund have a 100% funding target. So with this in mind, I will pass it to Mark and Nick to my left. They'll be presenting most of the items for you today. Gentlemen?
Thank you very much, David. I would like to wish a happy National Teacher Appreciation Week to all the teachers in the room. As a former teacher myself, I deeply appreciate your dedication to our youth and our future, and we are honored to serve the teachers of California through the Teachers Retirement System. Which brings us to why we're here today. We're here today to go over the actuarial evaluations for 4 programs: the Defined Benefit Program, the Defined Benefit Supplement Program, the Cash Balance Benefit Program, and the SBMA program. These are all as of June 30, 2017, so we're looking at assets and liabilities as of June 30. We'll start with the Defined Benefit Program. That means, among other things, that there are really no surprises today. The 2 big events that happened since between June 30 of 2016 and June 30 of 2017 was that there was a great investment return, about 13.4%, and the investment return assumption was lowered from 7.25 to 7. And actually, at the November meeting, David already presented all the results of those 2, so this is going to look very similar to what you've already seen. As a matter of fact, we could go back even further than that. I was remembering the board meeting in San Diego in February of 2017, where the decision was made to lower the investment return assumption to 7%. If you'd asked David or Nick or myself on that day what contribution rates we expected to be reporting today, they would be the ones that you see on your screens right now. The state supplemental contribution rate, according to the funding plan, would increase from 4.811% by the 0.5% permitted to 5.311% effective July of 2018. The scheduled increase in the employer supplemental contribution rate goes from 6.18 to 8.03% for a total of 16.28%. That's right in the education code, and we have 2 more prescribed increases in the education code in 2019 and 2020, at which point we'll reach a total of 19.10% of pay for the contribution rate. And the 2% at 62 member contribution rate goes up by 1% from 9.205% of pay to 10.205% of pay. And that is due entirely to the change in the assumptions. That is not based on the assets, that's based on the normal cost rate, which is only impacted by the assumptions. So it was lowering the assumption from 7.25 to 7, which resulted in that. Nick will go over the details of that with you. I also have to point out that there was no change to the 2% at 60 members, which means their contribution rate stays at 10.250. And it's just interesting to me that those last two numbers, it's not a transposition, but if we did transpose them, we'd get from one to the other. The 2% at 62 members are 10.205% of pay. The 2% at 60 members are now at 2.50% of pay. Now, you're probably not as concerned about the transposition, but what it does point out is there's only a 4.5 basis point difference between the two different member contribution rates. They are now very close together starting at this point. Going back to the top of the slide, the funded ratio declined from 63.7% to 62.6%. That is due to the change in the investment return assumption. If it had not been for the change in the investment return assumption, the good asset returns would actually have increased the funded percentage. And we're actually reaching a point where Nick and I had a little discussion about this, but we're turning the corner. I started out thinking maybe we turned the corner, but we're turning the corner because the funded percentage is actually projected to start increasing at this point. If there'd been no gains or losses on assets or liabilities, no change in the investment return assumption, we would have expected the funded percent to go up just a little bit this year. Now, we decided that we're turning the corner, we haven't turned the corner because, well, there's a lot of things. First of all, of course, the contributions are going up. But in addition to that, even though the funded percent is projected to go up slowly at this point, the dollar amount of the unfunded actuarial obligation is still projected to increase for the next 10 years before it starts to go down. So we're going to call that turning the corner, not turned the corner. Yes?
And I was thinking to wait to the end of your presentation, but to me, what you're talking about right now, Mark, is such a critical piece for our members. I cannot tell you how many, like in the last month, and David knows because I called him after a meeting one day, how many inquiries I've gotten from members kind of going, Sharon, you talked about the funding solution and thought we were, and I'm contributing more. What's going on with the unfunded liability? And so I think I've been around enough to understand what you just said to me. I get that. Can you just, for the sake of people in the room and people watching, but also just for those of us who spend a lot of time talking to teachers, is there an easy way to explain that? Because I think what people do is they read the paper and they look and go, why did CalSTRS unfunded liability, so that number
Does
looks
it grow?
scary,
Right.
right? That's a
Right.
big number and it's getting bigger. When we said this funding solution is going to get us to 100% funding. So, the numbers kind of seem to, and people are thinking short term. And so I can use all the language, but I wonder if you could help us by articulating that in a way that a layperson can understand it.
I will do my best.
Okay.
So I'm only turning the slide because that shows us the amount of the unfunded actuarial obligation in the first column here. It's currently $107.3 billion. And we are projecting for that, if all the assumptions are met, to increase for the next 10 years until it decreases. David?
Mark, I would say too, the numbers that I've heard is, we were at 68% funded and then we went to 64% or something like that because of the change of the assumed rate of return, right?
Right.
So whether it's the dollar amount or the percentage amount, the perception is those numbers are either, the percentage is going down, which is perceived as not good, or the numbers are going up on the unfunded and that's not good, so.
Right. So we've got a number of different things going here, and please tell me which one I'm not responding
Okay.
to.
No.
But first, so we went from 63.7% funded last year to 62.6% funded this year. If we had not lowered the investment return assumption by 0.25%, that would have actually gone up. That made about a 2% difference, so we would be, roughly at 64.6% if we hadn't changed the investment return assumption. That's due to the good investment returns from the last year. 13.4% is a great year. So that's one piece. That's looking back a year. How did we get from last year to this year? The second piece is looking forward. What happens as we look into the future? And we've got two numbers there: $107 billion of UAO, unfunded actuarial obligation, and a 62.6% funded ratio. Let me talk about the unfunded actuarial obligation first. Now, what's happening here is that we have the The contributions under the funding plan are still ramping up, so that will increase contributions in the future. And we also have overall payroll, which is projected to increase at about 3.5% per year. So those two issues are going to make larger contributions in the future. So we are actually, if we were to increase, matter of fact, let me just round those numbers just between friends to the nearest $100 billion. And let's say, let's say we had $300 billion of actuarial obligation and $200 billion of actuarial value of assets, then we'd have $100 billion of unfunded actuarial obligation. Let's say over the next 10 years, both the obligation and the assets increased by another $100 billion. Well, if they both increased by $100 billion, we would now have $400 billion of actuarial obligation, 300 of assets, and we'd still have the same 100 unfunded actuarial obligation. At the same time, the funded percentage would have increased. When we had 300 billion and 200 billion, we're be 66 and 2/3% funded. When we reached 400 and 300, we'd have been at 75% funded. So you can see that actually the system would be funding its way out of the situation that it got into in the past years, even though the unfunded actuarial obligation is not getting smaller. And so the situation that we're at now is it's not as though they'd both gone up by exactly 100 million. The obligation is going up by slightly more. So the unfunded actuarial obligation is growing while the funded percentage is getting better, which seems a little bit strange, but it's the way it works. To put it in yet one more set of words, I could say that $100 million increase in the assets is a larger percentage in the assets than $100 million increase in the actuarial obligation is as a percentage of the actuarial obligation. So I don't think I
See
made
how
it
you lose
simple.
teachers right
Can
there, though?
can I try a shorter version? I think maybe the way to describe it is related to like credit card debt.
Okay,
You know,
I
you
like
owe
that,
money on
yeah.
your credit
I
card,
like that.
and what we're doing right now is we're not even paying the interest. We're getting close, but that's why we need to keep ramping up the contributions, because all we're doing is keeping it from getting much bigger. But once we ramp up the contributions, then we'll not just be paying interest, but then we'll start paying your principal, and then we'll start to pay down. But it is a slow
Okay.
process.
Got it. Because like when you pay the minimum payment in your credit card, you never quit, it takes 20 years.
Is that
to
like
pay it
paying the
off or
finance charge, but the finance charge really doesn't take care of all the interest that you're,
Beginning.
right? Okay.
Do you want to try
Yeah,
another
no,
tactic?
I just want to, I'm not gonna try to add to the explanation, I just want to remind everyone also that, kind of going back to my opening remarks, when the funding plan was passed, even if you go back to the document that was provided as part of AB 1469, if you look at the projected funded status, we were close to 65% funded when the funding plan was passed. And if you look at what we told the legislature where we would be today, it was about the same level. We had told everyone, don't expect any improvements for the first 5 years. And the reason why we're a little bit, I know it's difficult, but that's why it's always good to remind ourselves
No,
that
you're absolutely
the
right.
funding plan was designed to have very little to no improvement in the funded status early on. And the reason why today we sit at a lower place than we originally projected, a good part of it was it was a very important decision made by you as a board to reassess our assumptions, to put it more in line with reality. But that led to us to reassess the size of our liabilities, of our obligations, pushing everything down, increasing the unfunded actual obligation. Again, it was a necessary step on your part, but that is kind of why we're sitting a bit lower today than we were when the funding plan was passed. So that's what we keep telling people, don't panic, stay the course, everything is working as planned.
Agreed. That last part I tell everyone because I know we have a long-term plan. I think it's just, in general, I think we just tend to be short-term thinkers and we read paper and we see numbers, and I think there's an emotional reaction to that. So I just want to thank you. That's helpful, and I'll let you.
Don't go too fast, though. Harry, go ahead, weigh in.
I
Yeah,
think
so-
it's
so
just,
to
I think
reiterate-
it's just, I think it's, human nature. You look at numbers, they look large, probably something happens within the brain, it's probably biochemical, something probably happens inside the brain, it's probably scientific. It creates an anxiety level where, if you take it out, the facts are, these are the facts, is we're long-term investors, we have a plan in place, and makes these assumptions, that over 30 years, this institution will generate a 7% return on investment, net of fees. If we reach that level and the contribution rates of the employer, the employee, and the state act out as this plan incrementally over time, this system will be fully funded by 2046. Those are the facts. The emotional aspect of this is, wow. And I reached out to Mr. Lamoureux because I saw it, and I had to step back myself, and I needed reassurance from David to reassure me that, no, this is what was planned, we expected it, it's gonna feel painful, it's gonna look worse before it gets better. It's like a patient, it's gonna be a little sicker before it gets healthier. There are gonna be variables that come into place. We took some volatility out of the portfolio on the investment side to de-risk the portfolio, which is one of the levers we had control over. So I think it's stepping back, it's in the plan, it was to be expected, and here's how we'll be fully funded.
Can I just ask one more?
Don't bring up credit cards. People have a bad reaction to
Oh
credit
my
cards.
gosh, wow.
That was very well said. I really can't add anything to that. The funding plan is working.
And can I just? So I just wanted to follow up on Jack, are we, because one thing I thought of,
Hang on, Sharon, I gotta
oh,
get
sorry.
Sharon
I think,
There you
are
go.
we good? Okay.
Yep.
The thing that we do so well, I think now with these fact sheets that we have, do we already have something that I'm not aware of? Grant's nodding his head, so, but just something that, I like charts, or just a reminder of the 5-year, or just something we can give members to, because I know that would help me just even with my own folks in LA, just a reminder of where we started, where we're headed now, exactly what Harry said, just, these are the facts, and this is where we're headed. Something that we can just give out to our members, I think, just because it's a good reminder of where we've come from, and now it's 4 years later, and I think it's a good opportunity for us to remind our members, where we've come from, but then also to kind of allay some of the fears that people have around some of these numbers, so.
We have two pieces we'll have available for you. One is a short two-pager that David and the staff and our communication staff put together that they already were using to socialize this board item with stakeholders. And then when we do the board highlights newsletter with you from this one, this clearly will be the featured story. And we'll make sure, especially the point you all were trying to make, I was just whispering here to Grant, that I think that's one we'll want to amplify in the board highlights newsletter from that. So we'll have at least two good pieces for you.
Yeah, sort of an answer to the question. The way I look at this is, if you look on page 48 of the actuarial study on table 14, I read the version that we got that wasn't in the book, so I don't know what TRB number it is. It's page 48 of the actuarial study itself. There's a column there that says available for amortization. It's over towards the right, and that number grows. Every year it grows. And, initially it's not enough to overtake the increase in the liability that grows, but that's where you see steady progress. Every year, more and more and more money is going to amortize that liability.
Harry, I think I had you on here. Okay, so you're good. And then Nora, did you no longer want to speak?
Well, no, I guess
Go ahead.
I don't know what I did. I think the same point for school districts and for other partners, I think Grant and I have been talking about this and sharing this information. We're in the middle of budgets in our college districts and our school districts, and there's a lot of conversation about sort of where this is at and how it's been impacting our members. So I think this is a very important piece of information to take back, and so we're gonna try to put together a plan to get that out there, because it will work, and people have to understand that this is really about investing in the future of teachers. So thank you, I appreciate that.
It was our intent also to have a special letter after this meeting, just to the superintendents and the leaders and on the employer side, so that they have a direct message from us on this, as well as the stakeholders. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Super. Jacqueline?
So I just wanted to add that we would agree that that staff recommendations consistent with the funding plan from our perspective and the governor's budget. And that we have some nice charts that we'd be happy to share with you too, Sharon. I'll send those out to the board.
I've used any, I love charts.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
All right, we're back to you, Mark.
Okay. Well, first of all, we very much appreciate the questions and the comments. Very helpful. Thank you. So the valuation is based on 4 key components, member data. So we have over 900,000 members. And really, that's the only thing that's changed since last November is we got the new set of member data. And so we trued up the assumptions, very small. We call them liabilities, gains, and losses since then, which is why the numbers look so similar to what you looked at in November. In addition to the member data, we have the program assets, which you can see below are $179.6 billion. That's the actuarial smoothed assets. We look at the plan provisions. There's no changes since last year to either the 2% at 60 or the 2% at 62 members. And we look at the actuarial assumptions. That's one of the big changes where we went from the 7.25 to 7. Pretty much looked and talked through the numbers on this from last year, but bottom line, the unfunded actuarial obligation went up from 96 billion to 96.7 billion to 107.3 billion. And I think we've already gone over why that's going to go down in the future and be paid off by 2046. So with that, I'll pass it on to Nick, who's going to go into quite a bit more detail.
Wow, you guys covered a lot of my material here. So, but I think. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Well, that covered a lot of my material. Well, I think graphically this really kind of emphasizes what both Dave and Mark said. This shows a projection of the funded ratio. The focus on the blue line first. That's where we are as of the 2007 valuation. And you see the gradual progress that we are projecting towards 2046 and hopefully 100% funded level. That compares with the green line, which was the prior year valuation, which still was projected to be projected to be fully funded at 2046. However, it was, as you can see, a slower progress initially. Which means the balancing item is the contribution rates, which means our projection of contribution rates are going to be a little bit less. There's still going to be increases, but they're lower increases. I'm not sure how positive that is, but that is the case. And lastly, to Dave's point, obviously, is this is where we were. This red dashed line, that's where we were 4 years ago. We were projected to run out of money. We've had some decent returns over that 4-year period, but we're still in the same spot if we hadn't had this change. And it's really hard to see right now if you look at the starting point where we are 63% funded. That red line would be about 61% funded. That means we have an extra $5 billion in assets that are available to pay teachers benefits because of those contribution increases and the funding plan. So that emphasizes where we're going to be, where we are right now, and this hopefully looks good for where we're going in the future. But the one thing I would caveat, of course, is that it's contingent on a number of assumptions and risk factors. We're not going to go into detail. We don't in our valuation report. And the main reason we don't spend a whole lot of time in the valuation report is your internal actuarial staff has their risk report they present in November, which is a really comprehensive review of risks. So we don't try to go over the top of that. We do have just one sort of simple but effective thing to discuss risk, when Mark is going to talk about the impact just of investment returns, future investment returns. Mark really covered this one, which is a change in funded ratio. As you can see, the assumption change caused the funded ratio to decrease by 2%. And then the good asset return, which was the current year, is 1.4% by the time it works through the smoothing. And then we reflect the deferred losses that we had from the prior years. That works out to a total increase of about 0.8%. So overall, it's a 1.1% decrease. The one thing, once again, on a positive note, I'd like to point you to is the expected year-to-year change. This really goes to Mark's comment about turning the corner. For the last 15 years, we have not had sufficient contributions, and this number has been negative. We are starting to turn the corner, and obviously our expected year-to-year change needs to be more than 0.1% if we're going to get to 100% funded. But over time, this number, as the contribution rates increase, this number is going to increase, and we should make much greater progress in the future years than we've made over the past few years. So for the 2017 valuation, really I think there's two results that directly impact the stakeholders. They are first the state contribution rate that Mark talked about, and then obviously the 2%, the contribution rate for the members who have the CalSTRS 2% at 62 formula. As Mark said, these were what we were projecting back in February of 2017, so they shouldn't be a surprise, but really since we haven't had this situation where we're lowering the that increasing the member contribution rate, we did want to just go through the mechanics of it quickly, the process. If you look at this table here, you see in 2016, we had a normal cost rate of 16.723%, and that's the first step in the process. We compare that to where we were when the original 8% base member rate for the 2% at 62 was set back in 2013. And at that point, the normal cost rate was 15.9%. And all this process is specified in the education code. And so the second step is that we do a comparison. Is that change more than 1%? Well, it hasn't been in the past years, but so basically we've said no change in the contribution rate, and we've ignored the rest of the calculations that we go through. But this year it is greater. As you can see in 2017, we have a 17.893%, 2% at 62 normal cost rate. That is more than 1%. Therefore, we go the process and basically we assign 50% of the normal cost to the members, and that is 8.947%. We round that to the nearest 1/4%, which puts it at 9%. And that's our base contribution rate. There's also a supplemental contribution rate that is specified in the education code, and that's 1.0205%. Mark's got me messed up talking about that so much. So that takes our rate to 10.205%. That would be beginning in July of 2018, and that would be a 1% increase from the 9.205% the 2% at 62 members are currently paying. And I'd just like to add one thing, is that as our one of our first steps in the process, as you remember, is comparing the normal cost rate versus the initial normal cost rate. That initial rate is going to reset at 17.893%. So when we do this comparison in the future, the question is, has it changed 1% from the 17.893%? So as long as we don't change assumptions next year, it's likely this rate it will not change, because the normal cost rate should stay fairly stable, except the one thing that upsets the apple cart is changes in assumptions. And obviously, as Mark said, no change for 2% at 60 members. Supplemental contribution rates.
Before you go any further,
Yeah.
what you just explained to us shows how complex the funding formula was, marrying that with PEPRA and all the machinations we went through to try to get that. And I think you guys do a yeoman's job of even trying to figure that out, because it's very, very complicated. We really appreciate it.
Yes, you're fortunate you spared a lot of the conversations that have gone between David and Jordan and myself. There's a lot of point A to point B to point C to point D and so on. So I appreciate the comment. So we look at supplemental contribution rates. So these are for the employers and the state. State, as Mark said, this was expected, a 0.5% increase in their supplemental contribution rate. Employers, that's fixed in statute for this year, an increase from 6.18 to 8.03 for a total employer rate of 16.28 effective July 2018. And that fixed schedule continues until July 2021, when then it becomes actuarially determined. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like. But first I want to focus on, moving forward, the state contribution, and to to determine the state supplemental contribution rate, we first must determine the 1990 structure UAO. So there's a lot of what ifs that go in this calculation. We actually do a separate valuation where we pretend that none of the changes that have occurred since 1990 actually occurred. So we calculate the actual obligation based on the old 1990 benefit structure, basically the 2% at the 2% formula instead of the 2.4%, and a number of other changes. And then also the assets do not take into account changes in the contribution structure since then. And also the assets also take into account that if the 1990, under the 1990 benefit structure, benefit payments would have been lower, therefore benefit payments out of the assets would have been lower. So we've got a lot of things that go in there, but I'm just going to get right to the chase, which is the actual obligation is about $235 billion. That compares to the actual value of assets of about $199 billion, which results in an unfunded actual obligation of $35 billion. And basically, under the valuation policy, the state is responsible for that $35 billion. And to pay off that $35 billion by 2046, we determine the supplemental rate that's needed. And we do the calculation as if that supplemental rate was implemented immediately, and that rate would be 8.213%. But there's a lot of constraints on that. So the one that applies here is there's only a 0.5% increase allowed per year. So since the supplemental rate was 4.811%, that means it would be 5.311% for the state. And that's the supplemental rate plus the 2.017 base contribution rate for a total of 7% contribution to the DB program, not counting the SBMA. And then we see how that kind of plays out in the future. As I said, we expect it to go up to around, our unconstrained calculation was about 8%. Versus the 5.311% we calculated. And you can see that in the red there, the state contribution is gradually going up to about 10%, which is basically our 8% plus the 2% base rate for about 10%. And then it levels off there. I should say it is projected to level off there, as obviously that's a while in the future and a lot of things are going to happen between now and then. So that actual number may change, but that's right now what we're projecting. So it gives an idea that there definitely is some increases in the future for the state. Next, we look at the blue line, which is the member contribution rate, since both the 2% at 60 and 2% at 62 rates are around just over 10%. That line is flat at about 10%. And lastly, we look at the green line, which is the employer rate, which goes up under the fixed schedule. And then when it becomes actually determined, we're projecting a small drop. Once again, that's in the future, and a number of things can happen between now and then that could affect that, but that's our current projection. So this is really the slide that kind of gets a lot of the conversation that Mark had and that the question that Sharon had on, what's happening with the UAO. And it gets back to my point is, as of right now, as we've got this big ship that we're turning, we haven't fully turned the corner, and that's because we're making payments and we're effectively paying down the interest, or most of the interest, but we aren't actually paying down the principal. That is the UAO, and you can see that in 2027 is kind of the inflection point where the projected UAA starts to decline. And just to remind you of what our colors here represent, the blue line represents basically the state's responsibility for the unfunded under the funding plan, which is about $35 billion, while the remaining portion goes to the employer of a little over $70 billion. So you've kind of got a 1/3, 2/3 ratio there on the UAO. And if you have eagle eyes, you can see the little yellow thing, which is our friend, the unallocated UAO. The good thing there is that's actually a little bit thinner than last year, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that going forward. But I just did want to mention that this isn't this projected increase in the unfunded amount. There are a number of retirement systems that have a similar funding schedule, so it's not totally uncommon. There is a movement towards having a stronger funding and not having what we call negative amortization, where we have increases in the unfunded. Obviously, a lot of time was spent setting up this the funding plan, so we're not recommending that you change that, but we just want to point that out because it's something you might hear. So getting back to yeah, sure.
So I know it's sort of an, there's science and art in this, but according to this chart, I mean, this chart's helpful just visually to look at and see that it does look like, I don't know, that I think it's helpful to be able to tell people, I mean, to anticipate that it's, I don't want to say it's going to get worse before it gets better, but the numbers are going to move in the right direction in looks like about 10 years, right? So is that,
Yeah,
I'm just, I always try and translate what we're talking about into what our members need to hear, to feel, because the big question we get is, how is my retirement safe? And, what's happening with this unfunded liability? And it looks to me like the numbers, the unfunded, increases to the point of about 10 years out, and then it'll decrease. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and
Approximately?
yeah, and that's true. And if you remember, we fund as a percentage of payroll. So I mean, one thing we could show, and actually I do show this on the next for the unallocated UAO, is that even though the unfunded is projected to increase, as a percentage of payroll, it's getting lower.
Right.
So we're kind of treading water, but but if we keep contributing X percent of an increasing payroll, then we start to make progress.
I wish there was a way to communicate, to global news sources and stuff, to just have a standard way they report about pension liabilities. Because I think people there's a lot of different ways these things get reported on. And so I think it creates more confusion, particularly for our members, because it's either a dollar amount or a percentage, and there's a lot of conversation in a lot of different circles about what's the right percentage of funding and things like that. So I just think a lot of times we're talking about it from a lot of different angles, and it would be nice if, we could all agree on one way, but that's a dream I'm going to die to, I guess.
Yeah, we always, our lives would all be simpler, but the reality is that this is what, we worked with a lot of different groups, and this is what we came up with. And, it's making progress. It's going to be slow, but, based on our current projections, we're going to get there. So moving to the unallocated UAO, if you remember, that's the unfunded attributable to new benefits. And by new benefits, we mean benefits that were not in place under the 1990 structure and benefits earned after June 30th, 2014. So initially, it starts off at a very small piece relative to CalSTRS. And how do we fund this? We do not actually fund it. In sense, what we do is we say, how much do we think the value of benefits earned each year are, and then we take contributions and put it, match it up against those liabilities. The problem is that the contributions aren't going to grow exactly at the rate we have, or the liability experience, people are going to live longer or live shorter. So those things, even though initially they're lined up, they are going to come out of balance, and we don't have any actual funding, where there's no mechanism to adjust if we come out of balance. And you can see that we are somewhat out of balance here. We started with an unallocated amount of 0 when we initially set up the funding plan, and that has increased up to $640 million back in 2016, and it dropped down to $370 million. So it does give you some idea that this is going to move around a bit. And as the liabilities and the assets that are part of this unallocated UAO grow, that the variance is going to increase. But just to put this in perspective, though, that $370 million, obviously not a small number, but as I noted here, it's only 1% of payroll. So if you wanted to actually fund it to 2046, that would only take, only 1/10 of pay to fund that down. So right now, it's not a huge problem, but obviously we want to keep monitoring, and this is definitely something probably want to think about when CalSTRS makes a report to the legislature. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mark.
All right. Any better than David said back in November, that we're doing this to look at risk with you, but the funding program is working. It's important to look at what could happen with good returns and bad returns, but the funding program is working. So First, the gold line is what Nick already looked at with you. This is the projection of the state contribution rate, and the yellow line in the middle is what would happen if we earned the 7% assumption. Well, it would increase by 0.5% per year until we were paying about until the state was paying about 10% per year. Now that includes the 2.017 base rate. It does not include the 2.5% SBMA amount. But what's perhaps more interesting is what would happen if we earned more or less. So what if we earned less? The green line shows the 25th percentile, which is a return of about 5.5% over the long term. So if we only earned about 5.5% over the long term, the state contribution rate would keep increasing by 0.5% per year right up until the end of the period to 2046. And as we'll see in a couple slides, the program would not be completely funded in 2046. However, we're also going to look at an upside, which happens to be the lower line here, which is the 75th percentile. 75th percentile return is about 8.5% roughly. If we earned 8.5%, then the state contribution rate would drop off after a couple of years, actually plateau for 1 year, and then we see it go all the way down in 2023 to 2.017%, the base rate. What happens there when it goes all the way down is that 1990 UAO has been paid off. So the state goes right back to now no longer as a supplemental rate, the state is only paying at the base rate. And then at the very end of the period, when AB 1469 expires, it goes back to the pre-1469 amount. Well, that's the state. So let's look at something even more interesting. Let's look at what happens to the employer contribution rate. So again, the yellow line is what Nick already looked at with you. It increases to 19.1% in 2020 and then is projected to come down to about 18% over the long term. But that's if we earn 7%. What if we earn first less? Well, the 25th percentile return, which was about 5.5%, the contribution rate keeps going up and it reaches the cap at 20.25%, where we have a 12% supplemental contribution rate. The most interesting line is the upside scenario, where we earn about 8.5% in each year. Well, initially, we overshot the mark a little bit with the 19.1% contribution rate, so it starts to come back down. But you may remember that there's a strange thing where good returns initially drive the employer contribution rate up. And we see that happening until about 2023. Well, something happens in 2023. If you remember at the prior slide, the 1990 UAO is paid off. So at that point, the state's contribution rate goes down. And at that point, we start looking at the funding program as a whole, which essentially means what had been the state's piece. I don't want to get too technical on this, but it is actually helping now to fund the employer piece. So every year that we get a good return, if we get good enough returns, guess what? They actually do help the employer. And so we see the contribution rate coming down steadily until around 2040, it gets back to the 8.25% base rate. So that takes us to the funded percentage of the overall system. So in the green line, we can see that with the 5.5% approximate returns, not only does the contribution rate go up quite a bit, but we only get to about 70% funded at the end. And when we revert to the prior system, when AB 1469 expires, the funded percentage starts to go down a little bit. You may remember from November that you have to reach about 90% funded just not to be declining when AB 1469 expires. The gold line is what Nick showed you. We get to about 100% funded if we earn 7% in each future year. Blue line we love. Not only did the contributions go down at the 75th percentile with 8.5% returns, but the funded percentage went up quite a bit. We actually reached 100% funded around 2032. So we're all hoping for the blue line, but we need to be aware that we don't get to choose which line the future will proceed on. Which brings us to the summary for the DB program. Perhaps the most important single thing is that the current DB program funding is projected to be sufficient. We're projected to reach 100% or extremely close by 2046. It will be slow progress for the next few years. This also increases that all the supplemental contribution rates allowed under the education code are implemented, which means that the employer rate goes up to about 10%, including the 2.017 base rate, not including the 2.5%. Excuse me, I'm sorry, the state rate, thank you, goes up to about 10%. And the employer rate goes up to about 19.1% in 2020 and then comes back down to closer to 18%. That's if we earn 7% in all future years. Those are significant increases. However, the future will be different because we can guarantee you we're not going to earn exactly 7% in each future year, and there will be other things which happen as well. So the action items then for the next fiscal year, according to the funding policy, the state supplemental contribution rate would go up by 0.5%, by the limits, so to speak, to 5.311%. As you may remember, Nick said that if we were going up to the entire amount, it would be closer to 8%, but we can only make a 0.5% increase. And the 2% at 62 member contribution rate goes up by 1% to 10.205%. Then looking forward into the future, next year, the legislature will be looking for a report of recommendations for changes to the funding program. We're going to be working with Dave and Jordan and Rick between now and then. And if you look at the work plan, January has a schedule for the actuaries to present recommendations, so you can look forward to hearing what those recommendations are in January. Those are actually all the comments for the DB program. So if you have any comments on that before we move on to the next 3 programs, we would be happy to answer them.
Hey, Mark, I just want to just flag that word change there for a minute there on the piece. You know, I think really because we have left the message here clearly that the funding plan does work and there's also risk around it. I guess the language I might suggest would be about how to strengthen the funding program if there were other ways of doing that. But, you know, we're not walking away today saying, oh my gosh, this needs to be changed in some fashion. But there's always ways to strengthen things and provide better downside protection that we could offer up as ideas. Is that what you were thinking, David?
Yes,
As well?
and I think it's kind of what we mentioned in November as well. Basically, the funding plan is working, and we're looking for ways how can we strengthen it and increase its chance of success. It's basically, and probably one of the items you can be sure that we will bring up will be that discussion around the unallocated, because that's the one piece of the unfunded liability that today you have no authority to set a contribution rate for. So that's probably going to be one item you can be sure you're going to hear back from us in January, that probably if the funding plan is to be reopened for changes, even if they're minor, that's probably going to be one that we're going to recommend.
Sure.
And with, okay, go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say with this, the recommendation is on TRB 14. The action item in front of you, which is to adopt the normal cost rate for the 2 at 62 member of 17.893% and adopt a supplemental rate for the state of 5.311%.
I'm sorry, I thought the resolution was on 97. You think it's on 40?
That's the recommendation.
Oh,
That's the recommendation is
okay.
on TRB
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
14.
And
yes.
then the resolution is on 97.
We have 2 resolutions, correct. They're on, you probably have the numbers right. Correct, on
Okay.
97.
Sharon, go ahead.
I had a couple questions. Mark, when you first started, I tried to take a note to ask you this, and now the slide's way at the beginning, but you were talking about the different assumptions and your calculations based on, and one of the things it was like the number of participants. And I couldn't find in the write-up, I'm sure it's in there somewhere, has the number of active teachers increased, decreased?
Yeah, I'll give you the specific number here. The number of active teachers over the last year from July 30 of 2016 to 17 increased from 438,000 to 445 or 446,000.
That's what I thought. I remember hearing that and thinking, that's interesting.
And that's a 1.7% increase
Got it.
in the number of active members.
Okay. And then, Jack, how do we, when we've had these contribution increases for employees, for faculty and teachers, so for these 2% of 62 members, is there a way we communicate to them this is happening? Like, so in their July paycheck, the grant?
Kind of on the communications around
Okay.
this, so I'm going to let him speak to that, but.
So I'm
we
just
have-
trying to recall, I don't, like
obviously
in
it's
my
happened
district.
Rarely, so, yeah.
Yeah,
Good.
right, exactly. It doesn't happen very often, so.
That's a good question. We were prepared for that. But really, the communications, I would say, started last year when you adopted the changed actuarial assumptions. So we've had in employee communications, newsletters. Last year, we did a circular to employers and a superintendent's letter to all superintendents, both after the valuation and after, or both after the experience study and after the evaluation. So that highlighted that the funding plan is working, what the changes were, but also the contribution changes and the likely 1% increase in 2 at 62 members' contributions coming up a year, coming up this July. And then we also created fact sheets for advocates to share. And then for this year, one of the things we're thinking about doing that's different is using our GovDelivery email system, which we figure will probably reach about half of the 2% at 62 members. We've already communicated in a spring newsletter that the increase is likely, and then the fall newsletter will also have communications around the 1% increase. We're also doing the directive to employers and the superintendent's letter this year. And so, I mean, it's a question of, do people read the newsletters that are sent to them? I can't say that that I read the ones, from the system across the street all the time. So, but we're open to suggestions people might have as well.
But I guess I was curious, so for I'm a 2% at 60 member, what am I? And I guess what I'm wondering is, so when sort of I guess we're the classic members, when we got the increases, does CalSTRS sort of count on the district to communicate that to members that this is happening, or does it just happen?
I think we're open to all ideas, and we look through for all avenues to communicate because it's a big group and it's really hard. And so to the extent that our employers or our member partners can help with that communication, we appreciate it.
I'm just thinking for this particular population, the 2% at 62, it's a 1% change, and it's, I think we all anticipated that it could happen, and now we're giving them a heads up, but I can just imagine some people, I know most of my members don't look at their paycheck, but I just think as much as we can communicate with districts to make sure people have a heads up that this is changing.
That's why we thought we'd experiment with more electronic communications this time and see if that does a better job than just the newsletter, which will have an article in it, of course. I guess we see ourselves as filling in the holes for the school districts. I'm afraid most employers would just say it went from A to B and you're gonna pay more. I think we'd like to make sure there's better context to the change rather than just people paying more, for something. So I think that's our job, is to give the context, in my view.
Right, I agree. Because the employers really should be communicating about, payroll issues with their members, but my experience is it's always numbers. It's never contextualized, and so I think if we can add some color to that, it would help our members.
So before we get off this topic, Lynn, Harry, are you on the communications to Pepper members? Go ahead, Lynn.
Thank you, Dina. So I had a question for you, Grant, because I've seen a couple of newsletters published by local school districts in the past month or two, and they seem to indicate that it's actually the CalSTRS board change in discount rate that has led to increased employer contributions. I don't know if you're seeing the same thing too, and if that's trying to address what's really going on here with the local school districts and maybe even their school board members, so that the right information filters down to the Pepper members and other employees.
I don't know if I've seen specifically the ones, I'm aware of that sentiment. There's a lot of newsletters, sometimes retirement groups put out newsletters that isn't exactly the same communication that we would put out. We do try and make corrections where we can, but I think it's important for us in our communications to really provide the story. It's very complex, but to explain what it is that drives the contribution increases for members, the normal cost change versus the contribution increases that are related to the funding plan for employers in the state.
And I would encourage that as any of us are going through time and we're hearing stories, try to get the source so we can go back to the source and correct the information at the source so that doesn't continue to be put out.
Okay.
I know we've done that with some newsletters from members and retirees or organizations, and so if we can get those sources, we can help make that
I think I
clear.
still have that newsletter, and I'll send it to you, Grant.
That'd be great. Thank you, Lynn. Harry?
just to add to this, I think just to kind of add some context also, sometimes why it makes it hard from the employer side is they're hearing a lot from across the river where it is a correct statement in that case, that the contribution rate is increasing because the CalPERS board lowered the discount rate assumption. They're hearing that we lowered it, so they make the connection, it must be the same reason. So we try to correct the message, but I think what doesn't help, and there is a real situation where it's true, where it's a true statement across the river, and it muddies the water a little bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Harry?
Yeah, the waters get very muddy. But I trust that our team is doing everything we can that's within our control. And I know we have a really effective communications branch and a government relations team. So the things that we have control over, I'm confident we're doing what we can. And the communication is only as good as the people that are communicating it. So there are lots of employers across the state, so it's going to be varied as to how well they communicate with their employees. I believe the unions have the unions have a responsibility as well to communicate with their members, so it's just not us, it's like 3 branches there that have, and then there's a sense of like personal responsibility. I'm taking home $50 less a month, what happened? Oh, okay, I understand, I'm paying more for my pension, yeah. So I'm confident the things that we have control over and never do for someone what they can do for themselves, right? That was like a lesson I had to learn. And it's like, I can't do for you what you won't even do for yourself. It's like for me, I think that's a dangerous place for adults, dealing with adults. Having said that, I will move the staff recommendation and the adoption of the resolution if that's appropriate, Madam Chair.
Please. All right, it's been moved and seconded. We don't have anyone else in the queue. Just really quickly, Grant, I know you said that we were going to be doing some email blasts to members, Pepper members that we have addresses for. Can we include information on that says, if you know another person that, so spread the word, so it gets word of mouth, and then include a link or whatever, so then they can encourage people to go sign up so we can capture their emails. We have a tremendous social media presence. Let's put it out there. Let's put links so people can connect, so we can capture more of their emails. Because the more emails we have, the better direct communications we're going to be able to have with our members. More venues. All righty. Is there any other questions, comments? Oh, I thought that might be a score of something. Pardon? Oh, Denise, do you have something? Come on up.
I just wanted to say thank you to the board and staff for working so hard on these educational pieces, because they really do help. In addition to the information that you're going to put in the board report, we are hoping for a 1-pager for the 2% at 62, like you were discussing, that we could have the background and context for people, and then we can get that out to all the locals in California, because as much as you're wishing, employers really don't explain it to anybody.
Right. And I know that CTA has a retirement webpage. And
Yes,
so that
they
can get
do.
posted on that. They have magazines
I
that
was
go
going
out
to
to
try and get
members,
it in the magazine as
stories.
soon as we get it, so.
The more prepared we can get, the pieces that we can give you, that makes it easier for you to put it in, we will try to do that for you.
Thank you very much.
All right. All right.
There's
Brian?
another one.
I just wanted to clarify the motion was made to move staff recommendation. I really think it is to approve the resolution on TRB 97.
Thank you, Brian.
Which reflects staff's recommendation.
Thank you. And Harry, that's going to be your motion, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Derek Lennox. I represent school employers here and in the Capitol, including the School Employers Association of California, the small school districts, and a smattering of other school districts across the state. I just wanted to express appreciation and also kind of concur, because we were talking about the role of employers in communicating this. When we send out client updates, which we occasionally share with your great team, to our employers, we really try to make sure to get the facts, but also the context right. So I'm always bugging David to get all of the context right and make sure that we're communicating the right thing. And we do see ourselves as partners with you. And when we go out there in the field, we have exactly the same conversation that you described having with your members, but it comes from a different place. Instead of, oh, we see our rates going, what's happening? I thought this was working. We see we're going up to 19.1%, and God knows what's happening. And we try to explain how the funding plan creates a lot of really positive incentives for school employers as well. And we can just compare it with what's happening at CalPERS, another really good system, but they don't have the same kind of functions in place that protect us from volatility and that have a third party sharing in the contribution system. So I just wanted to reiterate, because you might not hear it when you're talking with your folks, that we have the same exact conversations with employers. And so I appreciate the access to your team that you give us as stakeholders. That's really important for us getting the message right. Thanks.
Thank you, Derek. You know something, Grant, that kind of brings up another point. We've been talking about FAQ pages that we might be able to put on our website. I know we've got a lot of information on our website about funding and the plan, but if there's a way to condense that into something that's a one-page that could be easily accessed, then all these organizations could put a link to that, drive people back to the website. Okay, thanks. All in favor, say aye. Oh, I'm sorry, Carrie, I'm sorry. No, go.
As a teacher, as a former active teacher and now a retired teacher, I spend a little bit more time on the CalSTRS website than I did as an active teacher. So in that perspective, that I'm busy doing my lessons, carrying out my curriculum, I don't always have time to go on the CalSTRS website. Is there any way that you can send an email out and say, we just posted XYZ, take a look at it? You know, instead of looking at it every day or making a conscious effort to, have a routine to look on CalSTRS, because there's so much information there. There's so much. So if there's some way that we can do that, I think that would be very helpful.
Harry.
So the gentleman who spoke from representing the school districts, I wonder whether or not, because Karen, I think you're so right. I mean, like,
Absolutely.
I think about a classroom, they're not thinking about this.
Right,
But it's so important to them. And our job is retirement security for California's educators. What can we do to do that? So what would prevent us, if we're not doing it, to work with representatives from the school? Yeah, what is your name? Derek. Derek Lennox. If we're not doing it already, for our staff, just to present a brief email that could be sent to Derek, and then Derek sends it to superintendents across the state and asks that they send it out into school district email addresses that they have of their employees, and we could effectively communicate with tens of thousands of school teachers in their school district email, which they read regularly, all at the same time. They're all getting the same message, but it's being funneled in through. They work on the message, they send it to you, you then send it out to districts and say, this is on behalf of CalSTRS. It's very important for the teachers of your system and administrators to get this message. Please forward it on our behalf.
Yes, and the short answer is nothing would stop us from doing that.
Okay, good.
We do it indirectly by taking the information that we receive and kind of writing up the update right now and do the same thing, but we'd be happy to do it a little bit more directly. And I'll tell you where this, I think, will really make a difference. It's not for the big school districts that have a lot of staff and resources to be able to dive through this. So we represent the smalls. That's over 600 of the 1,000 school districts. Oftentimes, the superintendent may also be the CFO, may also be a teacher, so having that
If there
information-
is a CFO.
Yeah, if there is one. So, yeah, happy to do that.
Yeah, and I would
Thanks,
just,
Derek.
I would just chime on, we can put it through our reporting agencies and ask our reporting agencies to put it to their reporters too. All righty. Nora?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that my role on CalSTRS is a school board representative, so I've been struggling trying to figure out how to do this better. There is no actual description about what the school board representative is supposed to be doing, other than I happen to be a trustee and have that sort of expertise or that mindset when I'm sitting at the table. But that's what Grant and I have been trying to work together and have reached out to some of the other associations as well to try to figure out what we can do best. So any recommendations in how we can do this well, I think is something that I'm absolutely open to. And I do serve in that capacity, so I want to make sure that I can be a conduit. I come up here and I share what I hear on the ground, but I think that's always really important to be accessible and to, just ask people to use me as well if you need any help or if I can make any connections as well.
Super, thank you, Nora. Sharon?
And I think what's critical in this recommendation of us as in CalSTRS being the provider of the information is it will help with clarity and with accuracy, because kind of like what Lynn was bringing up, I hear all sorts of stuff in my own district and I'm like, have you guys looked at the website or talked, or asked me, as a board member, I know something about what's happening at CalSTRS. You just hear a lot of just things that are a little bit off. And so I like the idea of CalSTRS providing information so that for Derek and for, folks, it comes from CalSTRS, and CalSTRS is the primary source document as a good researcher, so that it's not just either our own unions or different organizations sort of extrapolating information and writing things up. It's actually, comes from CalSTRS so that we can trust that it's clear and accurate. And so I think from that standpoint, I think it would help us just focus on the facts.
We've been on this topic for about 20 minutes longer than we had scheduled for, which actually for us is not too bad. So I'd like to entertain the vote on the resolution that is on 97. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? All righty. We're moving on to the cash balance, or DBS first, right?
Yes, well,
DBS.
we're going to do them together. Hopefully that'll be quicker. So this is really a change of pace because these two programs are account-based instead of based on a monthly benefit. The Defined Benefit Supplemental Program, not surprising from its name, is a supplement to the defined benefit members. The Cash Balance Benefit Program is the retirement benefit to the part-time members. These have been very stable from a funding standpoint because the benefits actually adjust to the funding, which is also different from the defined benefit program. Those benefits are very clearly defined and the contributions change. Here the contributions are stable and it's the benefits that change based on the additional earnings credit. So we're going to go through this for both plans, and we're going to first determine the financial condition. We look at the fair value of assets. So we're not using any smoothed value of assets here. It's the market value of the assets. We compare those to the actuarial obligation, which for the most part is the account balances for all the active members. There are also some monthly payments for retirees, and we have the present value of those included. We look at the funded status, and based on that, the action is whether or not additional earnings credits can be granted under the board policy. So the bottom line is that the funded status for the two programs increased since last year. The DBS went from 111.6% funded to 122% funded prior to granting any additional credits. So that's kind of where we are before the decision is made. And the CBB went from 108.8% funded to 120%, again, prior to granting any additional credits. The primary reason for the funded percentages going up, again, is the same good return that the DB plan got, although the CBB is invested a bit differently. So if we look at the calculations for determining additional earnings credit, first we're going to look at the DBS program. It has an assumed return of 7%. So ultimately we're hoping to top up the overall earnings on the account values to 7%. They've already been granted essentially the minimum interest rate, which is based on 30-year Treasury bills of 2.88%. So that's where there's conservatism in it. We start with the 2.88%. So what we'd like to do is be able to allocate an additional 4.12% to get up to that 7% investment return assumption. So down at the bottom, we compare to, will we still have a 1 standard deviation surplus or reserve, if you prefer, after granting the 4.12%. It turns out that indeed we could actually grant up to 7.2% and still be at 100% plus 1 standard deviation. So we are able, within the board policy, to grant the 4.12%, or the board is. That would be worth $357 million if the additional earnings credit was granted. Then the funded percentage would go down from 122% to about 118%. That does leave more than a 15%, which is equal to a 1 standard deviation surplus. So the additional earnings under the board policy, the additional earnings credit for the DBS can be granted. The CBB is going to look very similar, except that the assumed return for the CBB is not 7%. It's invested a little bit more conservatively, so it's 6.5%. So with the 2.88, which has already been granted, essentially, that leaves a 3.62% additional earnings credit. And if we were to add that, that is $8.9 million, which would take the funded ratio from about 120% to about 116%. Now, because it's more conservatively invested, the standard deviation is actually a little bit smaller, about 13%. So we'd have to be still at 113%. Turns out 115.89% is greater than 113%. So the entire additional earnings credit can also be granted under the CBB. I think I skipped over it on one of the prior slides, but there is a second allocation. We're not close to that. To do the second allocation, you'd have to have a 2 standard deviation surplus after the first allocation. So that means we'd have to be over 130% funded for the DBS, over 126% funded for the CBB. So looking ahead to next year, if the investments achieve the assumed returns of 6.5% and 7%, it looks likely that, and we're on track for that right now, it looks likely that the additional earnings credits could be granted again next year. Looking at the downside, the plans could absorb essentially a negative 10% return, a little bit different for the two plans, and still be 100% funded the following year. Again, that would seem very unlikely since we're talking about the year that's ending this June, but I suppose stranger things have happened. And the action items then is that the board's policy calls for granting additional earning credits. We do maintain over a 1 standard deviation surplus in both cases, so those additional earning credits would be 4.12% for the DBS and 3.62% for the CBB. So if you have any questions, we would be happy to answer them. That was quicker.
Jacqueline?
I understand that this is consistent with board policy and totally get that from the staff recommendation. But just to be clear, sort of, if we weren't granting any additional, it would stay there and potentially protect against future investment volatility, right? I mean, this would just create more of a buffer. And I know that you're saying the buffer is sufficient right now, but I guess I'm kind of looking more long-term. I get that in the next couple of years, maybe it looks good. But is there sort of an argument to be made that board policy should be looked at, or do you feel like this is what the board policy should continue to be? And if this is an unfair question for you, I can kind of direct it to the group.
I'm sure either Nick or I'd be very happy to answer that. The board did look very closely at this policy just a few years back and actually did change the policy. Previously, the thresholds for granting the additional earning credits had been lower, 2 times the minimum interest rate and 3 times the minimum interest rate. And since that's 2.88%, you can see that 1 and 2 times a standard deviation of 15% is quite a bit higher. We did significant statistical testing of what might happen in future years, and based on that, the board made a decision that moving to the 1 standard deviation and 2 standard deviation was a prudent place to be. I would point out that it's not just the reserve that protects the funding of these plans, but the fact that the only thing that's initially allocated is a 30-year T-bill, which this year is 2.88% return. It means that anything earned in excess of that can be used to make up the funding deficit. The plan actually did, after 2008, was not where we would have liked it to be from a funding standpoint, but partially due to the fact that the only thing, I don't know if automatic is the right word, but automatically credited is that 30-year T-bill minimum interest rate. It caught up pretty rapidly.
It did, yeah.
Yep. So the two safeguards here are both the reserve and also the fact that in poor years, which are defined as when there's less than a 1 standard deviation cushion, the only thing granted is the minimum interest rate.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay.
Any further questions? The resolution for the DBS is found on TRB 134, and for the cash balance is on 173. I'd entertain a motion to approve either of those separately or together. Separately. Okay, you have to do it separately. Thank you, Brian. All right. So Nora, you're going to do the first one? Defined benefit supplement. Is there a second? And it's been seconded by Harry. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Any abstentions? Alrighty, and then a motion for the cash balance. Joy has moved that. Karen has seconded. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? All right.
Great.
Speed rules, I like that.
Okay.